Okay, so we've been looking at, in the previous video, we've been looking at how do we write a research question, and we try to understand what is a research question. And research questions, you will have research questions whether you're doing a quantitative study, qualitative study, or a mixed method study, whatever approach you choose for your research, you will have a research question. On the other hand, the section that we'll be looking at now is writing a hypothesis. But hypothesis is something that you will have when you have a quantitative study. Or in the mixed case, you have the quantitative aspect of your mixed research approach. And therefore, in the quantitative aspect of it, you will have hypotheses that you will be proposing, you'll be suggesting. So we'll talk about what is a hypothesis and how do we write a hypothesis, and I'll give us an example on how do we write a hypothesis. So developing hypothesis, two ways of looking at hypothesis. If you remember when we talked about the research approach and we tried to understand what is quantitative and what is qualitative, we said quantitative, it begins with a conclusion. It is deductive because it begins with conclusion, it begins with a theory and moves down to trying to confirm or disconfirm that possible theory. So it begins with that conclusion. It is deductive. And we say that the qualitative study is inductive because it begins with an observation of the participants, the sample that you are trying to investigate, trying to see. So you begin with observations and you come down to the possible development of a theory or possible development of a hypothesis. So quantitative is deductive, qualitative is inductive. In a very similar way, we have from that one, we have inductive hypothesis. Now, inductive hypothesis, it is a generalization made from a number of observation. Beginning from observation, you go down to making a possible hypothesis. So when you're starting with observations and then you're coming to the conclusions to making a hypothesis, that will be an inductive hypothesis. And this is obviously typical of qualitative studies because we said qualitative studies are inductive. They begin with observations, finishing off with a hypothesis, and that is an inductive hypothesis. The other one is deductive hypothesis, and you can guess this. This is related with quantitative study because it begins with a conclusion. It begins with a theory. So deductive hypothesis is derived from a theory, and it is aimed at providing evidence to support, expand, or contradict aspects of that theory. And this is typical of quantitative studies. So when we talk about hypothesis, you can have deductive hypothesis or inductive hypothesis. Inductive hypothesis is related with qualitative study, where you begin with an observation and then based on your conclusions, you come up with, okay, based on my study, this is a possible hypothesis I am proposing. With the deductive one, you begin with a hypothesis. This is quantitative. You begin with a hypothesis based on your reading of literature, based on the theories that you'll say, I have a hypothesis based on what I have read, based on the theories that I have come across. And my study is going to confirm or disconfirm this possible theory. So in defining what a hypothesis is a proposed explanation of a phenomena in the case of a qualitative study. So you've been observing and then you make a proposal. You propose, you say, this is the way I would explain what I have been observing. And you will come up with those hypotheses. And that is a proposed explanation. A researcher's tentative prediction of the results of a research. Tentative prediction of the results of the research in the case of quantitative. Quantitatively, based on my reading, based on what I have come across, I am making this guess. It is an educated guess. I'm making a guess. I'm making a prediction of what the outcomes will probably be. And then, of course, your study will confirm that or possibly disconfirm that theory. So that is in the case of quantitative. So what is a hypothesis? A hypothesis is, in the case of quantitative, it is an educated guess based on my reading. In the case of a qualitative, is a possible explanation, a proposed explanation of what has been observed through that study. So it's formulated on the basis of knowledge, the quantitative one, knowledge of the underlying theory or implications from the literature review. So it's based on the literature review that one has been able to see. So testing the hypothesis leads to support the theory, or maybe the lack of support for the theory. So you begin with the theory and you will either say my finding supports it, or you'll say my finding does not support the theory. It either confirms it or it disconfirms it. A good quantitative hypothesis, now for the most part, we will be using hypothesis in the case of quantitative studies. So when you have a quantitative aspect in your study, you will have hypothesis. With qualitative, at the end of it, in your conclusion, you might come up with a proposal. You may propose, this is the way I explain, and you may come up with a possible hypothesis at the end. But for our purposes in this course, you don't necessarily need to be doing that. Okay, a good quantitative hypothesis clearly and concisely states the expected relationships between variables. So when you have quantitative study, obviously you will have variables, and therefore your hypothesis has to show a relationship between the different variables that your hypothesis is addressing. It is important that there are two or more quantifiable variables to write a hypothesis. Okay, you need to notice they should be quantifiable. Quantifiable meaning they should be measurable. You should be able to measure your variables. So you need to state them in such a way that they can be measured. Because if you can't measure them, then you will not be able to do any analysis on them, and therefore you can't do the statistics on it. So you have to state your variables. They call them, operationalize them in such a way that you can measure them. So make sure that the variables you have are variables that you can actually be able to measure. So it's important that you have two or more variables, and the variables are measurable variables. And then your hypothesis has to be testable. Types of quantitative hypothesis, research hypothesis state the expected relationship between two variables. Okay, so it shows the possible relationship between the two variables, and the hypothesis can be non-directional, it can be directional, or it can be stated as a null hypothesis. Now, basically, when you have a hypothesis in a quantitative study, they should always be stated as a null hypothesis. Now, what is non-directional? It's a statement that relationship or difference exists between the variables. So when your hypothesis is stated in such a way that it says there is a relationship between the two variables, but it doesn't say how the independent variable is affecting the dependent variable. If it doesn't show that, it is non-directional. It just shows that there is a relationship, that's it. But if it shows that the independent variable is causing the dependent variable either to increase or decrease, then that will be directional. Okay, so directional hypothesis is a statement of the expected direction of the relationship or difference between the variables. So it is directional. I'll give us an example in a minute. The null hypothesis is a statistical statement that shows that there is no statistically significant relationship, no statistically significant difference between the variables. So when your hypothesis says that there is no statistically significant relationship or difference between the variables, that will be called the null hypothesis. And usually this will be the way you will state your hypothesis in a quantitative study. So if you have a if you're doing a mixed approach, and therefore in the quantitative aspect of your mixed approach will have hypotheses. So the research questions that are more quantitative, they will have possible hypotheses to them, and they should be stated as a null hypothesis. Okay, so let me give us an example here, non-directional. There is relationship between maths attitude and math achievement. Okay, it just says there is a relationship, but it doesn't show how the math attitude affects the math achievement. Look at the directional one. There is a strong positive relationship between math attitude and math achievement. So that means math attitude has a positive effect, improves the math achievement. So that is directional. Non-directional is there is no statistically significant relationship between math attitude and math achievements. So no relationship, that will be the null. Another example, there is difference in the achievement of students using technology or not using it. It just shows there is a difference. It doesn't show any relationship between the variables. In the second one, students using technology, which is the first variable, the independent variable, using technology will have higher levels of achievement than students who are not using technology. So the achievement will be the dependent variable, of course, and therefore technology, the use of technology improves achievement. So this is directional because it's showing the direction. Use of technology improves achievement. The null hypothesis will be there is no statistically significant difference in the achievement of students using technology or not using it. So this one, the last one, says there is no relationship. There is no statistically significant difference between students who use technology and students who don't use technology in their achievement. Okay, so this is something I want you to look at. And see what you think, which type of hypothesis it is. Identify the kind of hypothesis. There is a significant relationship between mathematical language and students' performance. What do you think? Yeah. So this is non-directional. It doesn't show this direction. It just shows that there is a relationship. The other one is there is no statistically significant difference in the means of transport used by men and women. Okay, the idea, just a point here where it says no statistically significant difference, it shows that it is a null hypothesis. Okay, this will be for you to do. Look at this question and see if you can write for me null hypothesis, non-directional hypothesis, and a directional hypothesis. So for the question below, write a null, non-directional, and directional hypothesis. How does increased standardized testing relate to student motivation? So if you pause the video and if you've done it, the answer for this ones should be something like this. So for the null hypothesis, it should say there is no statistically significant relationship between standardized testing and student motivation. The directional hypothesis will be with the administration of standardized testing, there is an increase in the student motivation, and the non-directional hypothesis will be there is a relationship between standardized testing and student motivation, where it shows there is a relationship, but it doesn't say which direction it is going. So this is briefly an explanation of an introduction to a hypothesis. So if you have a quantitative aspect in your study, you will have hypothesis. And therefore, your research question will have one or two possible hypotheses. So if you have a research question that is likely to be quantitative, then you will have some hypotheses, and I would encourage you to try and write them. The hypotheses that you'll be writing for your studies in your thesis, they will be the null hypothesis. Okay? So with that, I'll say congratulations on making it this far. We have gone very far on this one. So blessings on it, on you.